the community may or may not want this, but someone put this message out to the broader community, and those messages should be followed up by the police. They should be followed up by intelligence, because this indicates that there's an Islamist network that are willing to go outside the bounds of the law to assert their power over the Hindu community for offences committed according to their beliefs about their faith. So because that was a targeted incident where we're hearing terms like Mushrik, how do we know to what extent Mushrik applies? If you want to give your perpetrators, okay, you go, okay, I'm going to turn the other cheek. I don't want to inflame tensions. I don't want to rock the boat. You know, the community's been getting along okay until now, except for, 10 or 6 or 10 other different things that have happened. But, we'll just, keep the tensions down because we don't want to upset the multicultural fabric. This is actually causing more incidents to come, because what you're saying is we're going to give you permission to act with impunity. So that is actually not ahimsa. It's not non-violence. It's violence. And I think the community need to be aware of that. There may be diplomatic statements that are coming out, for example, on the Bangladesh pogrom. We had some statements coming out. There were diplomatic statements, and this is related, but it's not a Hindu, on the Salman Rushdie issue. But then you see the complete oppositional narrative coming out with the Nupur Sharma incident, which is a Hindu issue. So there's still a lot of injustice and inequity of how the media treat different situations, and they have been quick to blame Hindus. So the media, do I think that things are improving? I think people need to understand what anti-Hindu sentiment and Hinduphobia actually mean historically. And there's resistance to recognising that this word's been around for 200 years, 150 years for Hinduphobia and 200 years for anti-Hindu sentiment, anti-Hindu feeling.
Namaste. Welcome to Chitti Media. My name is Abhishek, and this is our current affairs program. Today, we will be discussing the anti-Hindu attacks that took place in Leicester City, UK. There are videos being shared throughout social media where you can see mobs of over 40 men shouting anti-Hindu slants, vandalizing property, and assaulting people in the neighborhood. These attacks took place on August 29th to 30th. We will also be discussing the recent rise in Hinduphobia overall globally. Today, I have Sarah L. Gates with me. She's been following the story very closely, and she'll be giving us some insight. So, namaste, Sarah G. Thank you for joining the program.
Namaskar.
So, for those of us who don't know, because the mainstream media hasn't really been covering this story as much, so can you give like a brief overview and just kind of the series of events that led to these attacks?
So the information that we have, aside from that, which we've got from social media and commentaries about what happened, is there were 2 incidents that really sparked tension. So Naomi Canton did one for the Times of India that talks about how a perceived Pakistani stamped on an Indian flag, and that was the incitement to what then happened, where a person from the crowd was assaulted and their shirt was ripped. And you can see from footage available on the internet that person got to a shop where they were protected from the crowd. There were slogans chanted which were lodged as a hate crime, which was Pakistan Murdabad. So death to Pakistan, and words like Murdabad. This is a case for us to remember, that those terms will be lodged as a hate crime in the future by the UK police. So the UK police turned up. From the footage, you can see that they've arrived and the person is sitting in the shop and they're not seriously injured. They've just got their shirt torn and they're probably a bit traumatized. There was another incident that occurred on Ganesh Chaturthi where there was a arati going on and puja to Shri Ganesh, and some 4 or 5 persons came along. Some persons from another community threw eggs at the puja, and then there were other peoples who arrived to bully the Hindus, and those persons were chased by Hindus. And one person was selected from, I think, 4 or 5 people who had turned up in a van. This is from Satisha's story. And so one person out of this van of people who rocked up to intimidate the Hindus was beaten by a Hindu. So we've got that part of the story just hasn't even come into the picture. So all of these cycles of retaliation that the other party is saying that these are just retaliation against Hindus for doing this to our own people, but those people had already incited the Hindus by one stamping on the flag, which is highly offensive, and the other one throwing eggs at a Murti. So those 2 incidents triggered everything off, and then it's not clear because the police are investigating and they're releasing information on their website. So if you want to get actually facts that are actually verifiable, go to the Leicester Police website. They have arrested some people. They've found people with weapons like tasers, knives. There's other charges or potential charges there. And they're looking for people. So there's photographs of 4 people that they're looking for on their website. And they did take drone footage. So they got, I think there were, according to reports, about 60 people arrested. Now, let me say that there is good ground support for the community from the police. They have special community liaison officers that go around and speak to the community in their language. So that one of those officers was responsible for calling in the police and making them take it seriously. And by the 3rd night, they said they didn't know what they were going to do. For the first couple of nights, they didn't really understand it. But by the 3rd night, they had it sorted. So you saw that there was a line of police blocking a mob. And that's when we heard the Mushrik cry in that footage.
Right.
Do you remember from the footage?
Yes, I remember that.
And then the van turned up behind the police and everybody sort of scattered. They were big shots when there was no van there, and they were going in with the rubbish bins. And then the van turns up and they're like, oh, suddenly their courage just faded.
Yeah, so I want to expand on your answer a little bit, because this seems kind of different than the narrative of this having anything to do with the India-Pakistan cricket match, which is kind of going around. Did that have anything to do with this conflict, or is it more these other incidents that led up to it?
So it depends, I guess, when the police come out and they can explain who did what, when, and how it happened. Like, who called these mobs down for a start? Who were these people? Were they part of either of the primary incidents? Were they really part of that particular community that had a vendetta against the Hindus? We'll find out the dynamics of how things happened later. So what we're not hearing from the British media is, the names of these communities. So what happened with the British, the BBC and Leicester Mercury, was that they were extremely neutral. And then because the Hindu community didn't put out a media release straight away, and we were kind of waiting for the police to start, doing more than the lockdown announcements and stuff, it's pretty unclear to the rest of the world what the relationship is between these 2 former incidents, and then how it spiraled.
Okay, so now it's good to hear that the law enforcement is on the ground level reacting proactively, but are they actually treating this as a hate crime? And do they acknowledge that there's like a religious angle to this?
They sure do. And I
Okay.
think there's a lot of praise to be given to the community outreach side of the Leicester Police, who are able to get in there and hear the stories on the ground in the language of the people. And there has been a hate crime lodged with a religious angle. Uh, I can't tell you at which step of these many incidents the hate crime was lodged. When you're looking at intersectarian and intercommunal violence, we've got a very complex web of, we've got Pakistan and Afghans. They were also having, fisticuffs. And
Mhm.
you've got what looked to be Pakistan versus India after the match, but we don't know. Was the person who had his shirt ripped, was he a Pakistani? It didn't, how can you tell from appearances?
Right,
So
right.
this is the problem when things get amped up and things get messy. You can identify from the crowd that there were people there that certainly weren't Pakistani.
Mhm. So actually, that can you actually expand a little bit on the complexity of a lot of times these issues get they're overly simplified and there's always one group versus the other group. Can you maybe give some insight into the complexity of the different groups that are involved in uh, in this incident, or
Well, obviously, until the police come out and give names,
it's still too early?
we usually go with names. So
Mhm.
because we don't have actual names of people that were arrested and charges laid yet, it's a little bit blurry because they're using words like, a man from X place, not X
Mhm.
communal group.
Right.
Um, but in terms of understanding any incident, it's very easy to contribute to the polarization. And that's what happened, is it
Mhm.
became immediately about Hindutva extremists are attacking Muslims and
Mhm.
they're Islamophobic and, it's all tied back to the dynamics that are happening in India. And now look how this is playing out. So we saw a whole um, the MEND and Five Pillars start putting out propaganda immediately. There was one that said politically motivated attack and RSS Hindutva and all of these, slurs and smears. And that was designed to polarize the community so that it would say, okay, it's Hindus versus Muslims, and Muslims are under attack. And we know from history, whenever these types of statements are made, what that is a war cry. So if they're going to say that Jai Shri Ram is a war cry, the war cry on the other side is Islam under attack, Muslims under attack. And what that does is it bolsters that sense of solidarity with the Ummah and with the community, so that certain people with a mind toward, like hoodlums,
Mhm.
with a mind toward enacting vigilante justice, will go in there and they will take on people's issues that have absolutely nothing to do with them. That's what we saw here. Was that certain actors were involved that had absolutely nothing to do with the situation, to the point that I've read a tweet from a Muslim from the community saying, we don't need anybody to come in and
Mhm.
help us. And I think there was a bit of leadership missing there, because between the Muslim media and the Muslim leadership, they were putting out very different messages. So
Mhm.
there was no consistency, and this polarization just made a very complex scenario of multiple incidents with multiple actors look like it was all about Hindus versus Muslims,
Mhm.
when they were actually about stomping on the flag. That was a national issue. So if that happened, that made Indians, right, feel
Mhm.
feel injured. And the other one was throwing eggs at the Morti. So
Right.
that was a religiously motivated incident. So whatever
Mhm.
flowed from that and whatever flowed from the other thing could be two separate things. But because of this propaganda and polarization that they just spurted out immediately with no corrective from the Hindu side or from the police at the first instance, it just went out of control on social media. And we know what happens when things go out of control on social media. That's when people get beheaded in India. We've seen it happen repeatedly. in Bangladesh. The whole pogrom thing was all about someone who posted something on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So the responsibility to these organizations and media outlets is not just theirs, it's also the responsibility of the police to make sure they are not putting this stuff out and to monitor the responses, because there's a lot of responses in there that are saying we should go after them, this is justified, this is retaliation, so they were amplifying it, the tension. And then on the other side, there was just silence. So there was no instruction for the Hindu community from these leaders. So that it is complex. So we have to be avoiding this polarization.
Mm-hmm. So now, one of the terms that we heard used in these videos that were caught was the term called Mushrik. Now, I personally wasn't familiar with this term before. I think most people are more familiar with terms like kafir, infidel. So, what is the background of this term? Is it something that's used similarly? Can they use it interchangeably, or is it refer to something specific?
I think that term is something that should be analysed very closely, because which community are using that? And the fact that you point out we don't hear it very often, it triggers this line of inquiry as to why don't we hear it more often? We always hear about kafirs, we hear about pajits, we hear about gobber brains, cow piss drinkers, and we know what community does that, right? Because we're familiar with this constant rivalry. So we always have this, you're a cow piss drinker, and then you're a camel piss drinker. You're a beef, you're a, you're a cow worshipper. Oh no, you're a pig, and we know we're familiar with this type of rivalry. But this mushrik term, that was something new, and it refers differently to kafir. It refers to a person who is a worshipper, a polytheist who worships many idols. And it's a little bit different to somebody who denounces or doesn't believe in Allah. It's something more from my reading saying that, okay, not only do you not believe or you denounce the authority of Allah, you actually distribute that credibility or the qualities of Allah to other beings. So you worship other gods in the way that we would worship Allah. You worship other gods. So it's kind of like an additional thing to kafir.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for that. It gives a little clarity on what that word means.
I'm not an expert on that.
No, but I appreciate it though.
We had to look it up, but the fact that we have to look these terms up, it does actually indicate this is something new, and it could be coming from another community that we're not used to dealing with, because we are familiar with certain themes and trends and language that happens in India between Hindus and Muslims, or between Hindus and Muslims, Pakistan to India.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
who
I mean,
are these
there could
groups
be a
using this
historical
term?
context to this that we don't know about. That maybe it was
Yeah.
used for polytheistic faiths throughout the world. So I mean, yeah, definitely have to keep a good eye on this. So another aspect I wanted to cover was there was a woman who lives in the city that she mentioned that a lot of the attackers had come from different parts of the UK. They didn't have a Leicester City accents, and I kind of want to get your idea on what does that actually mean? Like the fact that so many people came to this city specifically for this attack, like from throughout England. So, like, to what extent do these gangs operate?
So I can confirm that that's the case,
Okay.
that people did come in from outside. I can't confirm from which places they came. If you read the Leicester police reports online, there's some names of places being mentioned, so they can be added up. What that indicates to, from, prima facie is that that there's in the background there are organised networks of persons who are willing to conduct violence using weapons,
Mhm.
and they're willing to assemble at short notice from outside the community, and that the community may or may not want this, but someone put this message out to the broader community, and those messages should be followed up by the police. They should be followed up by intelligence, because this indicates that there's an Islamist network that are willing to go outside the bounds of the law to assert their power over the Hindu community for offences committed according to their beliefs about their faith. So because that was a targeted incident where we're hearing terms like Mushrik, how do we know to what extent Mushrik applies? The intelligence really need to get under there. They need to find these WhatsApp groups, Telegram, Signal, monitor Twitter accounts, look into email accounts, find out who it was that put out the call, and interrogate members of the community that were suspects quite closely to find out who are these networks. And then why is this type of mentality being endorsed by Islamist organizations like Islamist media organizations? Because we don't see the same thing coming from the Hindu side. We don't see people saying it was okay for this to happen. Get out there. I mean, we see the odd comment that you better defend yourself, but they don't say go out there and start attacking people for an offense against their faith. It's a very, very different equation. So, yes, there's escalation perhaps to a lesser extent on the Hindu side, and they're willing to defend themselves within the bounds of the law. But the other people are vigilantes who are acting outside the bounds of the law. And this is very serious because it means that at the drop of a hat, any incident happens with a person who's believed to not submit to the authority of their religion, any person could be a mushrik. Any person could be a kafir. You don't have to just necessarily be, a Hindu. So how many parts of the community are actually being threatened and risked by this type of ideology? So I take it very seriously. And I think these need to be sort of like, brought into some type of anti-extremism program.
Okay. So now, with these attacks, how should the Hindu community respond? Because we mentioned a little bit about how some of the media outlets were a little bit slow to respond, while the other media outlets they took that opportunity to really control the narrative.
Yep.
And there's a lot of times we make mistakes in how we approach these conversations as well, in terms of oversimplifying it and then kind of just jumping to certain labels and just mislabeling things, not getting our facts correct. So do you have any solution on how, as a community, we should respond to these sort of attacks?
Okay, so, I mean, the first thing is to prevent the incidents from taking place by having really strong community safety measures implemented between the leadership of the different communities. So firstly, we want to prevent and protect the community from incidents like this, and instill the values of pluralism and democracy, where there's laws that prevent people from going out and doing certain things, and there's laws that allow them to do certain things. So you need to know, within the bounds of the law, how far does freedom of expression how far is it actually protected? How far can people do certain things or say certain things and be perfectly entitled to do that, right? Because if you're entitled to do or say something, not even the police can help you. There's no cause, there's no justification to put pressure on a group of people who are acting within the bounds of the law, right? So the first thing is recognizing who's doing what, and do our community know what the laws are? And I think some of the feedback I got from, listening to the police was that people with, English as a second language, culturally and linguistic diverse peoples who come into the West, they don't know the law. So they don't know that we're perfectly entitled, for example, to critique certain things, like the Salman Rushdie incident. There is no law stopping him from doing what he did, okay? But according to the Islamists, the attack on him was perfectly justified. So these type of values, they don't fit into Western democracies. They need to know the law. And the same goes for the Hindu side. They need to know how to report things. They need to know, if you don't know the law, you don't know what is a crime in order to report it. If you don't know policies on social cohesion and anti-extremism and anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism and so forth, you can't judge, okay, what is the nature of this incident? Is this incident part of something broader, or is it specific? Is it just an interpersonal dispute between two members of the same community? You can't rationalize in order to be able to go and articulate the issue and why you've got a problem with it to the community liaison in the police, or make a report to the actual police officers at the police station. So they need to work with the police to begin with. And then when it comes to responding to incidents, if you don't do anything, you're creating the conditions so that the violence can continue. So they're acting with impunity. Yeah, like if you want to give your perpetrators, okay, you go, okay, I'm going to turn the other cheek. I don't want to inflame tensions. I don't want to rock the boat. The community's been getting along okay until now, except for, 10 or 6 or 10 other different things that have happened. But, we'll just, keep the tensions down because we don't want to upset the multicultural fabric. This is actually causing more incidents to come, because what you're saying is we're going to give you permission to act with impunity. So that is actually not ahimsa. It's not non-violence. It's violence. And I think the community need to be aware of that actually doing and saying nothing, even if you're doing things behind the scenes, if your community don't know, they don't have instructions. There should have been a 10-point instruction plan that came straight out from the police, supported by the different Sikh, Muslim and Hindu police associations. They should have all signed on to that, get their leaderships from their different communities with their names on it, with their temple names, their mosque, their masjid names, all of this, so that they can all hold everybody to account, and we can hold them to account and say, okay, well, you gave us these 10 instructions. This person's not complying with it. And then there's a well-organized system of law and order to enforce, and we can hold them to account. They can hold the police to account. Community leaders can hold their people to account. And so when one thing goes out of balance, everybody knows about it, and everybody can work on what to do to prevent it from spiraling out of control, because people will lose their lives. If you've got knives, like we saw, someone was stabbed with a knife for nothing. Like, this was an innocent person, innocent people who have nothing to do with these little gang rivalries are going to be dragged in, and it's going to hurt everyone. Even the value, the economy of the place, all the work that people have done to try and build social cohesion will go down the gurgler, because one cycle of this type of thing, it can just destroy the entire community for years, and the trust is gone. So I think it was irresponsible that there was no messaging from the Hindu side about how to protect their community and keep them safe online. And there was no critique of what this Muslim media were doing. There was no messaging from their leadership to shut down this propaganda. It's still there on the internet, and people are still responding to it. You Hindut for fascists, this is not India. There's one that got shut down that was saying that we will lynch you from your mouths, cow piss drinkers.
Wow. Why do you think it is that there's such a lack of response from the Hindu side? Or is it a lack of organization? Is it weak leadership? Maybe both?
It's weak leadership. It's weak leadership. It's they don't have the systems in place. There needs to be outreach workers, social workers, community safety workers. If they don't have funding for that, they need to organise groups that are registered to do that particular type of social outreach work, and get into the community and listen to them. So what we always see from this is that whenever an incident happens that, is a bit thuggy, they want to turn their back on it and distance themselves. Oh, this has nothing to do with us. Rubbish, it has nothing to do with you. It's a community. Everything has everything to do with everyone else, and it reflects badly on everybody, not only when it happens, but then when the community turn their back and outcast this group. It's like, oh, we're going to wash our hands of you.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is a little disappointing, but I, how? Okay, so there's a lack of there's weak leadership on one hand, but how do you see us communicating and working with the other groups, like you mentioned the Muslim leadership, the Sikh leadership, and how do you see that actually working out when there is a lot of uh, hatred coming from the other side as well?
Well, people need to welcome in a younger generation who are not afraid of confronting that hatred.
Okay.
I mean, people from our generation, Generation X and Generation Z, they've grown up around these conflict dynamics. They're familiar with the conflict dynamics. And it's all very well to say, turn the other cheek, don't engage in violence. But in certain incidents, they have to defend themselves. They need to learn things like martial arts from a young age. If you're living in a community that's having this type of communal violence happening, and your children don't know skillfully how to manage conflict situations, they don't have communication skills, they, they act in a passive aggressive way where, they pretend that they're above everything, but behind their backs, they're bitching about them.
Mhm.
Like this is not productive. This is passive aggressive. Or, you can be big shot on social media from an anonymous account and make all kinds of inflammatory, insightful comments, whether it's on one side or the other, it's coming from both. And I'm sure that, the degree of the violence is out of proportion.
Mhm.
Absolutely, it is. And the likelihood of somebody from the Hindu community following through on their big shot comments is very small. So don't make them. Like if you make a comment on social media, you can be tracked, whether you've got an anonymous account or not. And that will be considered, if you make a threat on social media, that will be considered a genuine threat, whether you meant it or you don't. So don't wear the consequences for something you never intended to do just because you wanted to be macho. Like, we need to be more constructive. There needs to be better dialogue. And these type of anti-Hindu attitudes need to be absolutely discharged of any credibility, because that's not possible in a society like the UK. This is not an Islamic state where those type of opinions and values hold any weight or merit. They're hate speech. So it needs to be dealt with as hate speech. There's quite strong laws that are already there for hate speech and hate crime. The police need to take this seriously, this anti-Hindu hate speech, anti-Hindu attitudes, anti-Hindu organising, this Hindutva RSS neo-Nazi fascist rubbish. This is rubbish. Every time that comes up, it's like anti-Semitism when they attacked, Zionists, and now Hindutva and Zionism are given parity and conceived to be one and the same group. And then they talk about the most hideous things, like they're both white supremacists and like hideous things.
Yeah. So
So
okay,
this is serious. Hindus need to take it like very seriously. I don't think they're taking it seriously.
no, I agree. So when the last thing I want to kind of talk about is what are maybe some positive developments that have come, because I do want to end on a more optimistic note, and I do feel like there is, even though we're not doing nearly enough, Hindus definitely not taking it as seriously. Is there any improvement on us being more proactive than we were maybe a couple of years ago? Is there a little bit more unity than that? Can you maybe give some examples of that you've encountered?
So there's been talk about a rise of anti-Hindu sentiment, but if you go back through history, you can see that this is a constant. So there's escalating cycles and spirals of communal violence that have been going on for centuries. So people talk about there's a rise of anti-Hindu sentiment. Well, actually, it's more like that it's coming out into the public domain and we can now see it.
Mhm.
So it hasn't been reported in the past, not because it hasn't been happening, but because there's been barriers to reporting. And one of those was that people don't know the law and they don't know how to take up their rights within, and whether it's human rights, civil liberties. And now they're starting to catch on and realize that there is a system there to protect them, but they need to use the system. So they need to document everything, meticulously. There needs to be members of every community that their sole responsibility, basically, is to document the communal condition that they're in, and to document incidents that are happening in their region, to document incidents that are happening in their nation, so that they can then show this is the scenario that's occurring within our country, and take this to the intelligence, take this to your local police, your federal police, your state police, take this to your community safety officers in your locality, and then start having this conversation about how to protect our communities, because they can then go into your temples, they can go into your community spaces, and they can teach people things like how to protect yourself within the bounds of the law, which is different in every country and every state. So they need to be very localized about building this relationship. Are they being more proactive? We're hearing a lot of talking about things on the net, which is great. We're hearing a lot about awareness raising. We're seeing incidents happening, quite confronting incidents happening, and the awareness is being raised at a higher level. So there may be diplomatic statements that are coming out, for example, on the Bangladesh pogrom. We had some statements coming out. There were diplomatic statements, and this is related, but it's not a Hindu, on the Salman Rushdie issue. But then you see the complete oppositional narrative coming out with the Nupur Sharma incident, which is a Hindu issue. So there's still a lot of injustice and inequity of how the media treat different situations, and they have been quick to blame Hindus. So the media, do I think that things are improving? I think people need to understand what anti-Hindu sentiment and Hinduphobia actually mean historically. And there's resistance to recognising that this word's been around for 200 years, 150 years for Hinduphobia and 200 years for anti-Hindu sentiment, anti-Hindu feeling, these kind of words, anti-Hindu legislation, anti-Hindu XYZ, anti-Hindu books. Catherine Mayo's book was branded anti-Hindu, and the Hindu Mahasabha went around to foreign countries to try and clarify with the media and with the communities that this is not actually what Hinduism is, and we're insulted and hurt by this. This is highly offensive, but it didn't stop people from using Catherine Mayo's work. So do I think things are improving? I think we have a legacy of injustices. And I do see that bringing the issue to the United Nations from India was absolutely fantastic. And we do need to look at other forms of religiophobia that are non-Abrahamic, and all of them, and include all of those, as our prerogative and as our agenda. But I do think we need to start funding institutions, think tanks, researchers, and to work within their discipline, not outside of it. Because we see a lot of hogwash coming out about what these things mean, and people love that. They click on it. It's like, you have any incident and it's been reported in a very polarized way, and that suits a lot of people's appetites, because they want to feel like, we want to get back at these people a little bit. We feel hurt. We want a bit of to assert ourselves back into the discourse. But if you don't put the facts down, because nobody's collecting them, and you don't know if you're not reporting them in this sort of factual way, then human rights observers can't do anything with it. So if you stick on terms like this is love jihad instead of sex trafficking, a human rights organisation is going to read that, and they're not going to know. They're just going to read all of the other propaganda that says that love jihad is a conspiracy theory. But we know it's happening. Forced conversions and abductions are happening all around South Asia. But for some reason, whenever they cross the border into India, everything becomes a big conspiracy, and an Islamophobic conspiracy. We need to use the correct terminology and start on Twitter being very careful about how we word our tweets, because our outrage should be directed at something which is an offence. So our outrage should be directed at child sexual exploitation, child sexual abuse, sex trafficking, forced conversions, things that are abductions, that are a deprivation of a person's liberty. How can she make a choice to be with a person or conduct certain activities when already her liberty's been deprived.
Right.
So when people, start commenting on a domestic violence incident where a partner has murdered in an Islamic kind of style, so they've had their heads chopped, murdered their partner in that particular way, then they slap on it love jihad. But there's so much more to that is actually recognisable to the Western authorities. They say, you don't listen to us. That's because there's language barriers. So use the correct terminology and put the facts and nothing more than the facts.
I see. So now, actually, that might be a good segue into your advocacy, and if you want to share a little bit about that and how, if people want to get involved and what they'll get out of working with you.
Oh, working with me. Well, look, I got some. I've got people interested in doing some workshops on community safety. So some of the things that we see in other situations that the police are well prepared for, like domestic violence, we're talking about incidents of violence and how to defend yourself or prevent these acts of violence from occurring. And when they do occur, what do you do? How do you respond to those? Because every situation's going to be entirely different. And so what the police can do is they can train people on a whole different range of scenarios that you may find yourself in. So you may be isolated, you may be unable to call the police. There may be, a disproportionate power imbalance, like someone's got a weapon and you don't have a weapon. Like, these are the kind of things you can't learn from a temple. No one teaches you from your shastras self-defense. Oh, well, there are shastras on self-defense. Those type of self-defense things need to be brought into the community. So what can they expect from coming to workshops? When we do run workshops, is some basic tools, practical tools. What do you do? Who can you get help from? Who are the experts? Because some guy on Twitter is not an expert.
Right.
You can't listen to people on Twitter when it comes to your life. You have to defend your life with expertise in particular ways according to the law. So there's going to have to be these type of discussions. How to document, how to use your phone, in what circumstances can you use your phone to record things, and when can you not use them, and how do you go about preparing reports? How do you keep this documentation? How do you compare documentations? How do you analyze documentation? How can you catch trends? How do you know that there's pressure building up in your community? You can't expect the police or the state or anybody else to do this work for you. This is your duty. So this is the kind of thing that we need to talk about. Practical skills to save lives on the ground.
No, I think that's wonderful. So thank you very much for what you do. Do you have any last closing remarks you want to make?
Firstly, I know this comes across quite harsh and fierce. However, I need to just remind everybody that how many attacks, how many brutal machete attacks, how many hangings, how many pogroms, how many targeted killings in Kashmir, how many harassment incidents do we need to see? Like the guy in Poland, we didn't talk about him, but he said something like, put your camera down and we will talk. He didn't even know that this symbol on the shirt of the offender was a white supremacist symbol. I mean, that could have been another Brenton Tarrant type incident or another Andres Breivik type incident. We don't know, we don't know a lot of basic things. And it hurts, to see this happening, because you can see the systems of support they're not functioning, they're not smooth. We don't have what other communities have. We don't have people on the ground doing social work. Well, we do, but not necessarily. We don't have Hindu temples teaching about what is anti-Hindu sentiment and what can you do about it. So everybody goes to temples. Everybody goes there. And they have a specific role to play in ensuring the health, like the hygiene of the community. And if people are at risk and there's tensions going on and there's no leadership from the Hindu authorities,
Okay.
they'll go off and they'll do whatever comes naturally, which is just basically fight, flight, freeze or fawn. We can't have that happening. We need to have viveka. Mm-hmm. So I apologize for my firm tone, but I'm really concerned that there's no community safety infrastructure.
No, so thank you very much for your time, Sarah G. So I think that's where we're on to talk right now. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.